All right, everyone. Well, good afternoon. I think we've had a few more people join us, and so I want to be very thoughtful about everyone's time today, so we will go ahead and get started. If you could, as you're joining and getting settled in, if you could kind of sign in by entering your name and organization in the chat box so everyone knows who is on the call, that would be great. And I will introduce myself first. So this is Jill Hoiting with Supporting Families Together Association, and I will be your presenter today. And I am just looking for my chat real fast. There we go. All right, so far I'm seeing Mickey having put her self in the chat box. So we have Mickey from Child Caring. Anyone else want to introduce themselves? Agnes Ring from the Family Resource Center, St. Croix Valley. Joni Meyerhofer, I'm sorry if I mispronounced, from United Way of Racine County. Matricia Patterson from Family Connections. Katie Rice, who is one of our parent leaders from SFTA's Parent Leadership Cohort. We have Renee Ernsting and Dottie Lillo from Child Care Partnership. All right, and we'll see if I can see a couple other folks. I think perhaps Judy Olson from Child Care Resource and Referral might be on. Sarah Cazell, who is an intern here with Supporting Families Together. Jackie, if that is Jackie Strand, up north at Northwest Connection Family Resource. Resources. Wendy is also a parent leader from our leadership cohort, and then we have Michael from United Way of Dane County. All right, so we have a good mix. We have folks from both Child Care Resource and Referral Agencies and Family Resource Centers, as well as United Ways. So thank you all for being here. The last intro I need to do is, sitting next to me today is Abby Kilgus from SFTA, who is also doing a lot of coordination for Advocacy Day along with Sarah Cazell. So big shout out to them in terms of helping us get prepared. All right, so today we're mostly going to be focusing on an overview of the Early Childhood Advisory Council recommendations. I know some of you guys have heard these in the past, but we want to make sure everyone feels very well versed and able to talk about them for Advocacy Day coming up, as well as any of your other work out in your communities as you're wanting to educate folks. And then we're also going to explore the 2019-2021 biennial budget that has been introduced by the governor. So those are going to be kind of our main pieces, and then we'll do a little bit of wrap up in terms of last preparation steps that you guys may want to do ahead of time. So, in getting started, I wanted, well, one first, can someone just confirm that you guys can see my screen and it should be showing a PowerPoint called the Prepared Advocate? All right, thank you, Matricia. All right, Matricia said yes. All right, so the first thing I just want to highlight for folks is that the 2019-2020 session schedule for the legislature has been published. It is on the Wisconsin State Legislature website, but here you can also see this is the schedule for the next 2 years. So where the arrow is pointing, we are right between floor periods right now, and we'll still be between them with our Advocacy Day, which is actually a really great place to be because it's not likely then that our legislators will actually be on the floor while we're there. And they'll have time to be considering things, and then the next week they go back into session. So that's great for them to be getting this information, so in case any components come to the floor about the budget, they'll be prepared. So you can kind of see through then the budget bill being sent to the governor around August 1st. It is possible that could be later. But that's kind of our timeline for the budget process. All right, so we'll start by looking at the current recommendations of the Early Childhood Advisory Council. So I think most of you probably know that the governor appoints an early childhood advisory committee or council. It's a requirement of the both Head Start and Child Care Development Block grants that the state have this. In Wisconsin, our ECAC has developed a cyclical process that they use for creating recommendations. And they focus on being able to introduce those in conjunction with the biennial budget process. So it's very strategic in terms of the timing. So these are new recommendations. They just got released last fall. And so this will be kind of the first time our groups perhaps are actually going down and talking with legislators about the specific recommendations. We'll also talk a little bit after each recommendation about the process for new recommendations and where the council is at with that. All right, so 2 recommendations came up to the forefront for the council in the last cycle. And the first one is the home visiting expansion. And the purpose of this is to expand evidence-based home visiting services in areas that are still underserved, including both rural and tribal communities, because there is still a number of areas in the state that do not have access to the service and where communities would really benefit from having it. So just as a recap for folks, evidence-based home visiting services are provided by trained professionals during pregnancy and in the early years, and they improve the lives of children and families through frequent and regularly scheduled visits that are really offered on more of a voluntary basis and address healthy prenatal practices, infant care, developmental milestones, positive parenting techniques, and goal setting. And so because of the way this is structured, and you'll note that the evidence-based piece is a really key aspect there, is that they're going to be impacting the most vulnerable families who may be experiencing poverty, families who might have lower education levels or be dealing with substance abuse issues or have a history of child maltreatment or trauma in their family too. And the impact there is that the evidence shows that parenting skills are improved, parent-child relationships are strengthened, there's support for early brain development, and then there's connections to other resources and supports. So we also know that there's a return on investment for home visiting, and each family enrolled in home visiting results in government savings of more than $1,000 per year, and that's from reduced cost of food stamps, or Medicaid, cash assistance, and that these savings are persistent. They go through childhood and long after a family completes the services. So we're seeing like a rate of return at about $5.70 for every dollar invested in home visiting, and that again is through savings in child protection, K through 12 special education and grade retention, as well as within the criminal justice system. So the specifics of this recommendation, it really looks to grow the current programs so that more families can be served by increasing that grant amount for 3 of the current funded programs, which will allow them to add a home visitor. And so that component of the recommendation would increase family slots by up to 60. And then it also looks to expand into new communities by adding sites in western and northern Wisconsin and within another tribe. And implementation follows kind of a 1-year planning period, and then will also include implementation at the remaining programs that applied for funding during the previous procurement process. So that kind of combined strategy will also increase the number of family foundation slots by up to 170. So we're looking at, if I can do math really quickly, about 230 slots of an increase there. So also on the slide, you can see by fiscal year, there is a lesser amount asked for in the first year of the budget, and then a higher amount asked for the second in terms of that additional implementation. And then also as a reminder for folks that we have seen success in this area actually with the last biennial budget process. So I just want to remind folks that this current recommendation is continuing to build on that success of the last recommendation. knowing that even with that bump of 3.9 million and expanding the capacity of the existing programs and adding 6 more, it still isn't covering the whole state. And so the council really took a strategy of let's incrementally continue to work at this and increase the funding for home visiting. So just want you to kind of recall and have in the back of your mind some of the information about the last increase. So in case at Advocacy Day, if a legislator remembered that was part of their last budget and wanted to ask about it, you would be prepared and able to kind of talk about what that expansion did and then how it will continue to build. Exciting news is that there is a home visiting increase in the executive budget that was proposed, and so more to come on that in a few slides a little bit later. All right, so then we get into this second investment. And this is around the early education workforce tax credit. So this is kind of a new policy that is looked at in Wisconsin. It's the idea of using tax credits to support childcare is not so new. We have other states that have been doing this for a long time, including Louisiana was kind of the trendsetter there. And then also Nebraska has implemented tax credits, as well as I believe it's Arkansas, who is working on this now, kind of in a similar kind of area that we are. So the council really identified a priority in terms of ensuring access to quality care. And as that priority unfolded, it really felt like, well, the wage and compensation issue is a significant barrier. And so they really looked at what are the different options and policy levers we have available to us to create an increase in that compensation. And so one of them was around Wisconsin shares and increasing shares to get more funding into the child care system. But there were concerns that it wasn't direct enough, but that also wanted to look at something fresh that we haven't talked about in the past. And so a work group kind of worked to look at all these options and came to the conclusion that an early education workforce tax credit was the way to go. The rationale behind this is that for a strong Wisconsin workforce, we need to increase the labor market pool. Early education is the most effective way to achieve this, because when access to stable, high-quality early education increases, more of Wisconsin's talent can join the workforce. And so access to early education increases by growing a stable, qualified workforce of early educators. And so that's where we arrive at this refundable tax credit for early education workforce that really can incentivize early educators to come and stay in the field. This also is a very much an economic development strategy, and I know you guys talk about this at the local level a lot, but the fact that working parents are demanding this high quality early education, yet it's often unaffordable or even unavailable in their areas, really creates a barrier to them entering the workforce. We also know that early childhood offers that two-generation strategy, and by looking at early education, not only are we supporting current workers across the state, but we're also cultivating and fostering the growth of our next generation of workers. So the information that you're seeing on the slide too is just a recap of kind of where we are at with the workforce in early education in Wisconsin. So we know there's a really high turnover rate. So we're at 36% with the last workforce study that was done. We know that programs are reporting closing classrooms and taking fewer children because they can't find quality staff to be in those classrooms, which is kind of growing wait lists for programs. We know that rural communities are struggling with this immensely, and that has also spread into urban areas too. And then we also see in the wage and compensation issue this pretty significant disparity in early education compared to other industries that require the same education level. So we see a disparity of about $5.50 to $8.50 for associate degreed early educators. And then that only grows with the higher degrees. And then lastly, as kind of the rationale and strategy, is that we know that businesses are reporting difficulty in finding workers. The estimate is about 80% of businesses have reported this in Wisconsin. And so a lack of available childcare is that significant challenge to the workforce now, but also for the future. And so James Heckman, the economist, said it greatly when he said, either way we're going to pay. Investing early allows us to shape the future. Investing later chains us to fixing the missed opportunities of the past. So I think that two-generation approach really comes into play here. All right, so when we're talking tax policy, I just wanted to do a little bit of review for folks, make sure people have more so that I think people know this, but it's more having the language to support the, the discussion. So when we're looking at tax credits, it's important to know why a credit was chosen versus some of the other options. And so we went with the tax credit, of course, to kind of try this new approach to increasing compensation for the early education workforce, and again, in that way that goes directly to them. But again, there's a nuance. It can't just be any tax intervention. It really has to be the right type of tax credit. So these charts describe a little bit about what different tax levers do. So the tax deduction, this is essentially, it is reducing the amount of income that is taxable. And so that can, well, it really actually, the benefit of it is highly dependent on an individual or family's, their marginal tax bracket. Because if you can reduce it to a lower tax bracket, of course, then your amount of taxes is changed more significantly. So that's just a little bit on the deduction side. But then when we go into tax credits, that starts to count against the tax liability that one would owe to the state, in this case, or the feds in other cases of policy. And so the non-refundable tax credit can't exceed the tax liability of the individual. So for example, if you owe $1,400 and are eligible for a $2,000 tax credit that is non-refundable, you'd only get the $1,400 included in your refund. So you'd not have access to that additional $600. So this really means that the greater benefit goes to those with higher incomes. And then the refundable tax credit that can exceed tax liability. And so kind of, and conversely to the first example, you would get the full $2,000 if you owed $1,400, but then we're eligible for that $2,000 tax credit. So just a couple of examples there. And the refundable is really critical here because when wages are low, like in the field of early education, it has to be refundable because they have a pretty lower tax liability in terms of being in that lower tax margin and in that lower tax bracket. So that's kind of the big takeaway here, is that for this to actually have an impact on the early education workforce, it really does need to be a refundable tax credit option. All right, so how would this actually work? We have about 22,000 early educators in the state, of which about 52% have an associate degree or higher. Additionally, we have about 3,700 programs that are currently participating in Youngstar, the state's quality rating and improvement system. And so the design of the workforce tax credit really is intended to support qualified early educators who are dedicated to quality improvement. And the structure really incentivizes certain factors. So we want to incentivize early educators coming into the field, increasing their educational qualifications, working in higher quality early education programs, and then staying with those programs. So longevity is key. So the eligibility criteria were really designed, again, to incentivize those elements. So to be eligible for this, a provider would need a registry career level 12 or higher, which equates to an associate degree in early education or an established equivalent. They would need to be a full-time employee in a 3, 4, or 5-star rated program in Youngstar. And then their employment in their program would have to have been at least a year or longer. And so from those criteria, it's approximately 6,100 early educators who would be eligible for the refundable tax credit at this time. Based on their education levels, they would receive either a 2,000, a 3,000, or a 4,000 refundable credit. So this would equate to an increase in compensation between 9.6% and 19.2%. So can really move the needle on compensation for early educators. Lastly, I think it's important to know that as the recommendation was formulated, we did go into exploring how a verification process would look and how we could build that really in a streamlined way based on existing systems that kind of bring together the registry, the Department of Children and Families, and the Department of Revenue, so that it's really ensured that this refundable tax credit would go to those who are eligible and only those who are eligible. So being able to do that and building on those existing systems, there's actually a very minimal administrative cost to this. There's a little bit of startup in the first year, and then it's only about $20,000 in the estimates to administer this in an ongoing way, which when you look at the total amount that we would be looking at, you can see on the screen it's $18,403,000 as an estimate of the actual tax credits themselves. So then add another 20,000 to that. So it's less than a percent, way less than a percent in administrative costs in an ongoing way. So really the takeaway there is that it really is all about the early educator and increasing their compensation. And then just as another reminder, when looking at these numbers, they are based on a 100% uptake rate. That's just how estimates have to be done for refundable credits. And so we know that it would be very unlikely to have a 100% uptake rate, but I just want you guys to know that that is what's reflected here. So to get any of the materials with the ECAC recommendations, you can Google, if you do Wisconsin DCF ECAC, it will come up there, the Department of Children and Families web page dedicated to the Early Childhood Advisory Council. If you scroll down a little bit, you'll see reports, and that report is the recommendation document. So there's more of a nicely designed kind of bifold piece that outlines the high-level recommendations. And then you'll see there are accompanying white papers that go into budget and implementation details for each of the recommendations. So we will have that information for you at Advocacy Day, but feel free to look at it kind of ahead of time, use it as refreshers, take talking points from those, however you prefer. The other piece that I need to mention, I didn't mention yet, with the Early Education Workforce Tax Credit, this is not currently in the executive budget. We'll get into what is in the executive budget, but it's just important to know that. And kind of as a reminder, this was developed so it was over the last 2 years, kind of ending in the fall. And so just in terms of thinking about the landscape changing and now having the executive branch and legislative branch of different political parties, different approaches might speak differently to them. So just kind of thinking about that and how an early education workforce tax credit can still be put out there, and how policymakers and decision makers can still be educated on this as an option of supporting the early education workforce. All right, and so in terms of future recommendations, the council has just started the new process last fall. So they start with more exploring and assessing needs and gaps across early childhood. And so recent topics that we looked at both in December and in March have included childcare deserts, unregulated childcare, access to childcare from the parent's perspective, infant mental health consultation, and expulsion and suspension. I would say the expulsion and suspension piece is carrying over from the last segment of recommendations. It just didn't make it into a formalized recommendation in the last round for the governor. So that's kind of still on the table and being looked at. From there, priorities will be formulated by the council, which will lead into the potential recommendations. Once those priorities are set, work groups will continue to really develop the recommendations. And just a note that work groups are comprised of more than just council members. So as you're hearing about the work of the council and what they're looking at, if you have interest in being part of any of these recommendations and kind of the building of those solutions, please feel free to reach out and get connected with folks too. So I want to pause there before we get into the 2019-2021 executive budget and just see, are there any questions specifically about the ECAC recommendations? So the timeline for the new recommendations, that's a really great point in terms of the process for creating them is aligned with the budget cycle. So this summer, I would imagine, is more the time, and into the fall, summer to fall is where the priorities will kind of be set and then the work groups formed, and then the work groups will have a little over a year, essentially, to be working on these solutions, recommendations for the needs and gaps that are identified. And the council starts to kind of review those and will approve them. So probably not this coming summer, but then the next summer is kind of when those have to get finalized to be introduced to coordinate with the next biennial budget. And I would say that's really important to kind of understand the scope of the Early Childhood Advisory Council. It is a council that is intended to advise the governor. So when we look at recommendations and what's coming out of the council, they are very much specific to what the governor can do. So whether the governor is using his bully, I can never say that, bully pulpit, whether he's kind of working to help introduce legislation he can't actually, or she in the future, you never know, can't introduce that legislation, but certainly can have influence. But then also the biennial budget, of course, is the biggie, where he's introducing the budget and can put a lot of different priorities in there. So that's kind of where that influence has lied in the past. Any other questions? All right, so we will move into the executive budget, which I think everyone is probably has heard lots about it and wants to dive in to know how early childhood is showing up. So I do have quite a number of slides because I think the good news is there are a lot of things that support children and families, especially in those earliest years, in the budget. So we will go through some that are really more specific to kind of family support and early care and education, but then some others that are still very much early childhood issues and definitely come together with those two areas, but might be a little more tangential than what we usually talk about, but I think they'll be of interest still. All right, so a little bit on the executive budget first. I do want to say, though, that we are working on the speaking engagements for Advocacy Day, and the intent is to actually have more of an expert in talking about the actual budget process, so that everyone goes in feeling very prepared about that. So I'm not going to go into that today, but we are going to look at the specific budget pieces today. And I would say with questions on these, I may not have all the answers today, but please do ask your questions now as they're coming up, because I will do my best to get answers to those that I don't know before Advocacy Day, so that we can all feel as prepared as possible. All right, so this slide shows a snapshot of the Department of Administration's website. So on here, I'm actually going to try to move out of my PowerPoint here and show the actual website. So here, if you start at the Department of Administration's homepage, you'll see it's highlighted the biennial budget. It's a big deal. So it's right there on the front page. And if you click there, you'll see actually the whole history of biennial budgets. So you can go in and see what was done in the past if you're so interested. But right here at the top is the current biennial budget. So you can see this the governor's budget letter to agencies. This is when Governor Walker sent out the letter to the department leads. And then major budget policies can come in here. But then down here you get into more of the specifics. So you can see what agencies requested in the budget last fall. And then estimates, but here the very last bullet point is the 2019-2021 executive budget. So that's kind of what I think you'll find most interesting at this point in time. So it'll take you to a whole nother website that has tons of links, but I think they're very helpful. So the top three here are what I would call the suite of documents. There's a budget in brief that is way more narrative. And goes into the various priorities within the budget. You can open that so you guys can see what it looks like really quickly. So the budget in brief, you'll see it is a very long document, still 121 pages, but significantly shorter than the actual budget. So I would recommend, as you're wanting to look at this, to use Control Find and kind of search keywords that you're interested in. It makes it much easier. You can also use, of course, the table of contents to kind of get into more of those areas. But just so you know that that part is there. And then also you have the complete document of the budget. This is actually it's comprised of all of these individual agency budgets too. So just know you can take a shortcut if you're interested, say in the Department of Children and Families budget or the Prevention Board for Child Abuse and Neglect, their budget is in there too. So I will open the big one so that you can see, but it does have some explanations at the beginning. You can see how many pages up there it is, very, very long. And it's, yeah, it has some nice explanations here in the introduction so that you kind of know what's being looked at and what is being compared across the tables. So I think it's a pretty useful tool as well. And then lastly, the budget bill itself. So this, the governor presents the budget. Joint Finance actually then gets the bill created essentially. So if you look at the bill text here, and I think you guys are probably familiar from last year's Advocacy Day, I believe is when we kind of went through some of the state legislature's websites. It may have been 2 years ago, I can't remember now. But so kind of same as any other bill, you're going to see the bill numbers. It's important to note that it's Senate Bill 59 and Assembly Bill 56. Just so you know, if those are referred to by SB 59 and AB 56, you know what people are talking about. They're talking about the budget. But I find it easiest to look at the bill text using the PDF. It's just in a nicer format here. And so they give a little bit of an intro from the Legislative Reference Bureau, but then scrolling down a little bit, you get into more of the explanation. And again, this is organized in a similar fashion around topic areas. But the first part goes more into the overall summary in more layman's terms. And then as you get further past that, then you'll see the actual statute changes that are made by the budget bill. So you can really go into a lot of depth here if you like. And then again, I would definitely recommend using Control Find to be looking for the areas you're most interested in. And so that's just a little bit of lay of the land in terms of the documents you have access to and what can be really helpful kind of in preparing. But it's also, these are the primary documents I have been garnering the information I'm going to present in the PowerPoint from. I did also use for a little bit the state superintendent's budget from last fall too, so you'll see a little bit from that. All right, so transitioning back to the PowerPoint. So getting into the executive budget, I kind of have it organized by topic areas here. And the first one up is home visiting. So this is really interesting in terms of the home visiting increase that has been proposed in the executive budget is kind of sandwiched within this other suite of investments for Healthy Women, Healthy Babies initiative that really is aimed to improve birth outcomes. It does a number of things. It creates a medical assistance reimbursement for doula services and provides grants for training doulas. It increases funding for the Women's Health Block Grant. It allocates positions within DHS to create an infant mortality prevention program to address the disparities that we know are significant in the state. It expands postpartum Medicaid eligibility. So currently, pregnant women are eligible for Medicaid at higher income levels, and that currently will lapse after 60 days postpartum. So you can imagine that that is very hard for new mothers or mothers to new babies, even if they're not a new mother and have any kind of medical complications that creates instability. So the bill is looking at expanding that eligibility to 12 months. So that's one key piece that's in there. So then we get into the actual home visiting proposal, and it is looking at providing an additional a little over $1 million in TANF in the first year of the biennium, and then a little over $2 million in TANF in the second year of the biennium. So that is approximately almost $3.2 million, just shy of it, for the biennium. And if you remember from the ECAC recommendations, their total was in the $2 million for the biennium. So this is actually going above and beyond what the ECAC recommendation was. So that's a pretty good investment there. So then we get into childcare, and the I would say the big investment in childcare that's in the executive budget is around Wisconsin Shares. So this, the budget proposes an investment of $23 million per year to increase rates within Wisconsin Shares to at least meet the 50th percentile of the market. So every, also biennium, the state has to submit a plan for the Child Care Development Fund to the feds. Within that, they have to report what the percentiles are for full-time care in the most populous geographic area of the state. So as of the 2019-2021 CCDF plan, you can see by age range here for both licensed centers versus licensed family child care, what those percentiles are. And so the percentile means it's based on the market rates, but what it looks at really is that based on the percentile, that families could purchase that amount, that percent of slots within the state. So for example, if you're at the 50th percentile, families would be able to purchase 50% of the slots. They'd have enough money that would cover about half the slots in the state. The other 50% would be above the reimbursement rates to be able to be covered at that level. So when we're looking at that, the federal government actually recommends, but they don't require, so we haven't had to do this, but they recommend this being at the 75th percentile as kind of a benchmark standard. So even coming to the 50th percentile, which is a huge jump, as you can see, from our very low percentiles, particularly for infant and toddler care, that we still have some ways to go. I think it's also important to note, just a so folks know, so infant in this context is really defined as 6 months, toddlers 18 months, preschooler is 4 years, and school age is 6 years. And full-time is described as 35 hours of care or more. So I think it's also important to know the kind of background for what has happened in the past with Wisconsin shares. And so folks who have been in the field longer than me can recall that in 2006, the payment rates were frozen, and that kept them level for many, many years. It actually lasted 7 years. And so, as you all know, I mean, inflation happens, so a freeze for that many years is pretty dramatic for providers, and it has had significant impacts. We did see in 2014 a slight increase in the rates, and then in the last legislative session, as you recall, there were also some proposals, and the governor moved to increase rates for infant toddler care, as well as kind of moving some of the reimbursement rates that are tiered with Young Star levels. So some of those changes have been made, and the budget does call out that this increase of the $23 million per year that's proposed would be on top of those approved rate increases from the 2017-2019 biennium. So it's kind of continuing to accumulate. This would bring the total budget for child care subsidies to $376.9 million for fiscal year 2020-2021. So that's a pretty significant investment, and I think you know, when we talk about all of the different ways that we can infuse more investment into the child care field, this is definitely a big one, and that's definitely a significant investment. All right, the other piece that comes into play with Wisconsin shares is the component that looks at how certified providers versus certified family child care providers versus licensed family child care providers are looked at. And so this is actually a little snippet from the budget bill itself, because I think it's nice. It gives a little bit of context as well as what currently happens with subsidies. And so right now, DCF, while they determine the maximum subsidy rates for services provided by or for child care subsidies, and they also do determine the maximum subsidy rates for services provided by certified family child care providers, they have not been able to set the rates at 100% of what licensed. So there is a discrepancy in licensed versus certified reimbursement rates. So you can see in the bill language that based on the certified provider, it could be no more than 75% of licensed child care, or no more than 50%. So this allows certified to get 100% of licensed as well, licensed child care reimbursement rates. And so that is taking about an additional $1.7 million in TANF dollars, so that there's increased funding for certified providers. And I think as many of you are thinking about the work, we see certified providers really fill in a lot of need, especially in rural areas. They are often family-friended neighbor care, becoming certified to care for really specific children in their lives. So this really is a support for access to, well, even to just regulated care, let alone high quality care. And then the certified providers, of course, are eligible to participate in Young Star as well. So they have access to quality improvement supports and would have eligibility for that tiered reimbursement for any children on Wisconsin shares as well. So pretty significant for certified family child care, and could definitely help with some of the access issues. All right, so there are a couple of other smaller pieces in the executive budget, but that are central to child care. So there is very specific funding to prioritize the zip code 53206 in Milwaukee to ensure access to quality childcare. The way it's kind of outlined in the budget is that there would be access to Teach and Reward and specific training through MATC, which is the Milwaukee Area Technical College, for early educators, but then also the issuance of a request for proposals to establish the first 5-star center in the zip code. And that request for proposals, the funding for it would cover startup costs as well as ongoing subsidy. So very specific to the Milwaukee area. We also see an investment in pyramid model coordination. I think many of you might be aware of the changes that went on with staffing across the departments, including the Department of Public Instruction and the coaches that were regionally based that help support some of the local implementation with pyramid models. So the folks who would help to get more people trained to become trainers in the pyramid model, those kinds of things. That's changed a lot, and a lot of that had to do with funding changes, of course, and so this actually is putting some investment back into the pyramid model coordination to really help support the professional development and resources associated with social emotional development through childcare. And so you can see that $415,000 in the first year of the biennium, and then increases to $535,000 in the second year. And again, that is TANF dollars. Caregiver background checks. There is a little bit of language about the background checks. I think you guys are probably all very aware too about all of the changes that have been happening in terms of what's required in a background check and who's doing the background checks. So the bill makes various definitional changes, changes to who can conduct a rehabilitation review, changes to the timeline for an appeal of a decision of DCF in the context of background checks. And I believe that this is also kind of with all of the new requirements from the Child Care Development Block Grant reauthorization too. So having everything aligned there. So I don't have more specifics and details on that, but know that that's in there. So the last one under child care that I wanted to look at more specifically was the child independent care tax credit. So we're going back to our tax credit pieces. So while not the workforce tax credit, there is a tax credit in the bill. So this particular piece is looking at a non-refundable tax credit. So when we recall who that helps the most, the higher your income, the more of a credit you could potentially be getting back. The non-refundable tax credit, it would actually mirror what the federal child independent care tax credit would look like in terms of eligibility. And then it would essentially allow families to claim half of the amount that was claimed on the federal return if they had claimed that. So just boiling all of that language down, but you can see all of the descriptor there, and if you want more context to know. The estimate from the executive budget, or this is really in the budget brief, an estimated net increase of nearly $10 million annually beginning in 2020-2021 to benefit about 110,000 taxpayers. So you can kind of see the scope that they believe this will impact. All right, so then we get into 4K. 4K definitely shows up in the executive budget, and I should say that's not only specific to 4K, but also 3K. So just a little bit of background context. 404 of the 410 school districts do offer 4K, so that's only 6 school districts that don't, and I believe one of those 6 is working on startup. And so 4K is, while it's not mandatory, it is nearly universal in Wisconsin. It's getting pretty close in terms of access. You can see here in these charts just kind of the trends for school year over school year in terms of the offerings and how much it has grown from the late 90s. And then you also see just a note on community approaches down here in terms of where school districts are reporting working with child care programs to deliver the 4K services. All right, so that's one piece. We're going to get into the expansion of 4K to be full day, and then also the early childhood education grants for urban school districts. Those are kind of the two related pieces. So this description is actually taken from the superintendent's budget. It was just more descriptive, but we see that appear in the executive budget. That essentially right now, the 4K program, the students are counted at 0.5 FTE for half-day programs, but they can get up to 0.6 per student if they're doing the additional outreach activities with families, so more family engagement. The executive budget would basically allow school districts to choose to offer full day 4K and get the 1.0 FTE. It would also continue to provide the startup grants that are available to the school districts who are not yet providing it. Way back when it started, I think in fiscal year 2009, startup grants were at about $3 million annually, and they have just reduced over time. So it is at $1.35 million that's available for 4K startup grants for this upcoming year. And they have kind of a gradient scale of, then the first year, districts can access $3,000 per 4K student for that first year of implementation, and then in year 2, it reduces to half to the $1,500 per 4K student. So those stay in there. I think the one key piece that I really do want to note that the way it's phrased, it is up to the school district to decide whether they would implement full day 4K. It's not across the board, if you're offering 4K, you must do full day. It is just making that a possibility. All right, and then you will see the early childhood education grants. So again, this top piece is actually taken from the superintendent's budget to just kind of describe this. And it creates a new grant program to provide funding to the biggest urban districts, the 5 biggest, to start up new or expand on their early childhood education program to be able to include 3-year-olds and start 3-year-old kindergarten. So the 5 big districts are Milwaukee, Madison, Kenosha, Green Bay, and Racine. And it's roughly estimated that among those 5 school districts, they're serving about 20% of Wisconsin students. And so that would start with these districts that they would be then eligible for these award grants to be able to develop, implement, and administer those new components. All right, and so there are just a couple of other random components in the budget that I thought might be of interest to folks because they do touch on early childhood in some ways. So one is the Family and Medical Leave expansion. So as you know, the Family and Medical Leave Act is at the federal level, so states are required to at least meet those standards. But then states can expand and have even more stringent components. So there are a couple of pieces that are being looked at. And so under current law, an employer that employs at least 50 individuals on a permanent basis in the state must allow for the family and medical leave pieces. The bill is looking at requiring this for an employer that employs at least 25 individuals on a permanent basis in the state. And then it also kind of expands what family and medical leave could be taken for. So I want to draw your attention to kind of the bottom sentences here within it. And I thought this was interesting, actually. I hadn't heard anything about this. And I don't know what implementation will look like, but it allows for DWG to determine rules about qualifying events for families to take leave. And many of them, as you can see, looks at deployment with the U.S. Armed Forces, or an impending call or order to cover active duty. But also, you see in this last piece that it could also be due to an unforeseen school or child care facility closure. So I just wanted to kind of draw people's attention to that because I thought that was interesting and had not heard anything about it. I would say the bill is also expanding the definition of family for the rules, so it would allow employees to take family leave to care for a grandparent, grandchild, or sibling versus just the parent or child that is defined, or a domestic partner that is in the current definition. So just a couple of pieces there. I would also say I did not read any language about this changing the status of being paid. So currently FMLA, it is not required that it be paid, and I did not see anything that would change that in my reading. The other couple of items I just wanted to highlight, folks might be familiar with the Read to Lead program. That there has been a council and there were grants offered years back. This used to be under GPI, and then it was transitioned to DCF, and I think it was the last budget. But as you'll see here now, the bill actually eliminates the Read to Lead Development Council. And then the last piece I wanted to highlight was the budget bill also proposes that families who are on W-2, that they meet the eligibility requirements. Right now, if they have a child that is 8 weeks old or less, they can receive the W-2 funds and not be required to do the work component up until that child is 8 weeks old. So this is extending that from the 8 weeks to allow up to 12 weeks. So kind of postpartum 12 weeks is kind of how you would say something about that. So I thought that was just another piece when we think about the whole spectrum of supports for families, that is a small change, but could be a significant change for families. All right, so again, there is so much in the budget, there's a lot to look at, but these were just some of the things that stood out to me that I thought folks might be interested in. And so before we get into kind of our last components about preparing for Advocacy Day itself, I just want to pause and see if there's any questions from folks. There is one question, will you send the PowerPoint out to everyone? And yes, I can do that. Also, as when you joined, you probably heard the voice say this is being recorded. So we'll also share the video so people can hear kind of the narrative of the PowerPoint too. All right, so the legislature, the governor, and the community. So you can see you have multiple audiences in terms of who you can educate on these early childhood issues, some of the things that are on the table, kind of help people understand the context in which those are being proposed and what they might mean for families and child care providers in your areas. So there's a lot of different ways to connect around this. So based on where we are in the budget process, like last year, we were not in the middle of the budget process, so it might have been a lot of ongoing education and thank yous, those kind of things. Now, this year with the legislature, it's really kind of feedback on the budget items. The budget is what they're all going to be looking at and thinking about all the time. So it's kind of that prime opportunity to educate about the things that are in the budget. Same thing with the governor's office in terms of thank yous and giving feedback, because of course, as you know, with the process, and we'll get more into that, once the legislature votes the budget through, it goes back to the governor to sign or veto and see whatnot. So that process is always ongoing, so good to think about the executive branch and that education too. And then, of course, in your communities, the more people who know and understand these issues, the more people who are out talking about this, talking with their own policymakers, their own elected officials about it, the broader the net that we're casting. So anyone from businesses to other organizations, other key influencers and communities, I would say are another definite audience you can be talking about these early childhood proposals about. All right, so there is, of course, a little bit of prep we want you guys to be thinking about in terms of the Drawing Near Advocacy Day. And one of those is you guys have been practicing year over year, kind of honing and developing elevator speeches. So of course, you're going to have your elevator speech for your legislative visits again this year. So this is just a reminder of kind of the 4 advocacy essentials. So you want to make sure it addresses who you are, what your issue is, why your issue is important, and then what do you want the listener to do about it. So kind of what that ask is. And again, that ask is customized to you and kind of what you're able to do in that spectrum of advocacy. So during the Advocacy Day, we will actually have some time to more practice, but also to embed more storytelling within your elevator speeches as well. So just be thinking about those questions and kind of preparing your elevator speech to work on and use the day of advocacy. So another key step between now and then, it is not too late to register for Advocacy Day. And we want you to continue to make invitations. So you are welcome to bring people who you would like to have with you on legislative visits, or who you'd like to coordinate with your community. This could be a board member of your organization. It could be a parent or grandparent or other caregiver. It could be a child care provider, a business sector partner, another community organization partner. It could be a volunteer. It could be so many different things. And so please be thinking about who else would be great, especially when we're kind of thinking about storytelling and who has stories that they can share that can really illustrate the importance of these issues. And so I want to pause there because I know both Wendy and Katie, I hope you're both still on the call. But as 2 parents within our parent leadership cohort, you guys have kind of self-identified to say, hey, I'm interested in advocacy and getting out there, and we'll be at Advocacy Day at the state capitol, but then also going to Washington, D.C. to advocate at the federal level. And so I just want to pause and see if Wendy and Katie, if you're willing to share with the group kind of what it means to you and kind of your perspective on what an invitation to other parents in the community might really mean and how it might be received.
Hi, this is Wendy.
Hi, Wendy.
Just making sure you can hear me. I'm on my cell because we're traveling. So, well, I guess I really wanted to do Advocacy Day because I'm pretty new to advocacy, and it felt like a really great opportunity to learn a little bit more and kind of just begin my journey. And I think it means a ton to parents to be asked to participate in something like this. And I think if we were asking more parents, we would see a lot of participation because these issues are so, so important to us. Did I answer all your questions?
I think you did. Thanks, Wendy.
Yep.
Hi, this is Katie. Sorry, my baby is very fussy right now. I kind of the same with Wendy. I'm new to the advocacy thing. We've been talking a lot about that in our parent leadership cohort, about being advocates for childcare and different aspects like that. Being a parent myself, you know, I'm in graduate school right now online, and having childcare is just not in our reach. So we're living on one income, and it gets very tough. And so that's why I think it's important for us parents to speak up. I think it's important for the parents to do it because we do have our own personal story that we can share that will, that we can share with others that will really touch other people. And like Wendy said, I think the invitations, I wouldn't have known about the advocacy days had I not been invited? So those invitations are crucial to help people understand and help them to share their stories also. So, sorry, I hope that made sense. My kids are.
No, absolutely it did. And thank you both for sharing your thoughts on that. So kind of just reiterating those messages, please don't hesitate to make the invitation. The more voices we have, the better. And I think that the way we structure Advocacy Day, it's actually a really safe space for people to kind of enter this realm. It doesn't feel too uncomfortable because you're going with other people, and we try to prep people in really good ways so they can stretch a little bit but not go way so far out of their comfort zone that it doesn't feel good. And we want, of course, them to keep coming back and keep being advocates. So please really do consider who you might be able to bring along with you to Advocacy Day. And then our last little piece of preparation, make sure you bring a smart device on April 2nd. We're going to have some activities that will go much more smoothly if you have a smart device with you. So whether it's your phone or a tablet or whatnot, please just make sure you have something with you for those activities. And then just as a last reminder, if you haven't registered using the SurveyMonkey link, please do. We can resend that out to folks. Please feel free to email me. I think you all have my email and Abigail's from previous emails and getting connected into the webinar today. So please feel free to reach out if you want to talk through anything before Advocacy Day or have questions after we leave the webinar. Please don't hesitate. We are here to support you guys for sure. So I'll pause there. We have about 5 minutes in case there are any other questions as you guys have had time to kind of think and digest. All right, well, I think that was a long enough pause. So please, again, reach out with any questions or if you need anything from us, and we will plan to see you on April 2nd then at Bethel Lutheran Church for the morning and then heading over to the Capitol for the afternoon. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day.